Welcome to today's special edition of the Turnaround Pastors webinar series. This is a special edition today because for the first time we are going to be publicizing the results of a comprehensive 2-year study into the distinguishing leadership behaviors and characteristics of successful church planters. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Gordon Penfold, our lead researcher on this project.
Well, good afternoon. We'd just like to welcome you to Turnaround Pastor webinar. And in this case, we're looking at the Berkman Method, a powerful tool for assessing, training, and coaching church planters. And privileged today to have been privileged to be working with and continuing to work with Dr. Steve Smith. Steve has worked with about 70 church plants. He's coached a number of church planters, but he's worked with over 70, not coaching, but just worked with 70 church plants. And he's been a real help in this process. This research process actually took a little over 3 years to complete. It was difficult to find planters willing to join us. And then we're also joined by Joshua Saros. Joshua is a church planter. He helped plant one church. He's been involved in 2 church revitalization processes, and now he's planting another church in South Carolina. And so we have a really good team of individuals. And at that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Smith, and I'm going to let him go over what we're going to be doing today.
Yes, thank you, Gordon. We've been working, as Gordon said, for 3 years on this project, and we were specifically interested in seeing how the Berkman Method helped us to identify the characteristics of successful church planters. So we asked people from planters from a variety of denominations to participate with us. Some did really well in their plant and had planted several times. Some were not successful, actually closed their church plants and still participated in this process. And we recognized the need for this particular issue because as we'll talk about later, there's so much money that goes into church planting, so much investment, not just money, but people investment. And we wanted to help those who assess planters to have an excellent tool that will give them more insight into the people that they're asking to take the steps of faith to plant a church. And I became acquainted with the Berkman Method through my introduction to Gordon and the group that he works with, the Turnaround Pastors. They had previously researched it and to see how it helps them to identify pastors who would be really good at helping churches turn around a church, to revitalize a church. And that research led to them writing a book and coaching different denominational groups in the area of revitalization. And Gordon had said to me in our conversations with each other, him knowing that I had been involved in church planting, that he was wondering what the effects would be what would we discover about church planters if we use the Berkman methods? And this has started the process that we've culminated in this presentation. Let me give some definitions here, because we are talking about successful versus non-successful. We were really looking at a certain level of success. So one of the things that I suggested is that we look at planters who have grown a church at least to 200 and have experienced the minimum of 5% conversion growth through that process. In other words, these are churches that have become self-sustaining, are able to find themselves a new pastor in case the planter needs to move on, can afford a place to establish themselves in the community, because that's really what church planting is all about. It's not just starting a church and letting it run its course, but establishing a church in a community so it continues to have a gospel impact for years to come. And in the process, we discovered that there were different levels of church planting success. There were tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, which Josh will talk about later. But it's clear to us in the research that level 1 and level 2 planters share a lot of similar characteristics. And the main difference between them seems to be in the area of evangelistic effectiveness, which is something that really comes from their focus, not necessarily their Berkman characteristics, but on what they find to be most important in terms of what they're doing. And we're applying this research now to come. Let me just rephrase that. We are seeking to help church planting organizations look at this from the point of view of assessment. What can you find out about your church planters before you ask them to go to the field? And to maybe help these church planters either to improve their skills or coach them to improve their skills. And what was the questions about there, Gordon?
Oh, at the end, this is just an outline of what we're going to cover, and then the questions will be at the end. We'll answer some questions at the end.
Yeah, so at the end we'll have some questions, and you feel free to put your questions into the chat area and we'll respond to them. So here's the big questions. Are there distinct behaviors that exist between what we call tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 church planters? That's one of the questions. Secondly, how can we help church leaders and planters identify their sweet spot in ministry? And can we enable church planters to improve their ministry abilities? Something that we believe that Berkman is really helpful in. As I said before, church planting is the practice of starting a fresh expression of the church to firmly establish a new congregation that will continue to sow the gospel in its harvest field. And again, we set out to discover what characterizes effective church planters. And I talked about this standard already. We want to be clear that there are other kinds of church plants out there, and we tested them as well. But this is what we were looking for to help us to distinguish clearly the characteristics of those who are more successful at church planting, more suited to that kind of ministry. Why the standard? As we said, it's easier to tell the difference between them. And that doesn't mean that people who are less effective couldn't plant a church. Some people who are in tier 3 actually planted churches, and some of them grew quite large. But in terms of their growth, much of their growth was in the area of transfer growth rather than conversion growth. And this is something that I believe is really important to think about in terms of church planting. If we're starting a church, what are we starting it for? Hopefully, it's not just to gather in saints who want this kind of a church expression, but we're actually sowing the gospel and reaping a harvest in a way that hasn't been done before. That's what I think about church planting, and hopefully that's what you think too. There's a cost to church planting, and this is why we need this kind of tool, why we did this research. There is an emotional and spiritual cost to this. When you ask somebody to go to the field and plant a church, what we're essentially doing is asking them to take risk. And there's a risk that they will fail. And when we don't put people in the place where they belong, if we ask them to plant a church and they're not really suited to church planting, there's an emotional and spiritual cost. They begin to doubt the goodness of God, or that they're failing God. And for a lot of these planters who fail,
there is no further opportunity for them in ministry. Nobody wants to hire them as a pastor anymore, because if you fail a church planter, you must be no good. And that's an unfortunate consequence of putting somebody on the field who doesn't belong there. There's also a cost to the family, because families of church planters often sacrifice the most of anybody, even more than the planter themselves. And so when there is failure going on, several things happen. Number one, the planter is taking more and more time away from his family to sustain the church plant, trying to make things work. And so the family can come to resent ministry altogether. The children can be turned against God because they see their father and mother suffering. So this is, again, characteristics that happen in families of failed church planters, and this is what we want to help you to avoid by supplying this tool. There's other costs. Next cost is dollars, and of course we put a lot of money into church planting, sometimes as much as $250,000, and that's not all coming from the denomination or organization. That's being raised by the planter, and these are dollars that will not come back. By that I mean that if the church fails, the investment ends right at that point. There is no more ongoing gospel sowing in that community by that local congregation, that expression of the church. And so that is a lost opportunity, of a lot of dollars going out the door for no long-term benefit. And finally, there's an impact on the harvest field as well, because this is why the church is there, to share the gospel. And when the church closes its doors prematurely because the planter wasn't the right person to be there, then that means that there is a loss of the gospel presentation in that community. So when you have such potential costs, it's clearly important that you use the best tools to use to identify candidates who are gifted for church planting. This is what our heartbeat is about, and why we're here today presenting this information that we have learned in this process.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the research objectives and kind of take you through the research. So what we wanted to do was assess a large group of church planters. So we were looking for 60 plus from all over the country. And we wanted to identify the effective traits of tier 1 church planters and compare them with tier 2 and tier 3 church planters. That's what we were hoping to do. And then develop an assessment grid using the Berkman method to assess these church planters. So that's kind of the objective of it. And then I think what comes later is creating a training and coaching tool to aid church planters' growth and effectiveness. So when we talk about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and all of these types of things, one of the things that we don't want you to hear is that once someone's in a tier, they are just going to stay there. That's where they're at. Our hope is to be able to coach them to be more effective church planters, but it's just a starting point where they're at now. So we use the Berkman method to do that. And if you're not familiar with it, there's more than 65 years in business. As you can see, it's been used by a lot of people, a lot of organizations. There's 4 million profiles. And there's over 40 report formats for the Berkman. If the strength of the Berkman is this, it's reliable. There are consistent results. It is valid. It measures what it claims to measure. So if it says that it's going to measure, and we'll get to some of these terms here in a minute, like usual behavior or different needs or whatnot that might be below the surface, it is what it measures. And so it is also certified as well. So this is a legitimate form of assessment. And one of the keys, and I think one of the pieces that is really unique to Berkman, is it measures below the surface. It measures something that's unavailable in other personality types. So this goes beyond just traits. It's also going to take you below the surface. So let's talk a little bit about some behavioral dimensions, and then we'll talk about how these play with one another. So what you see on the outside of a planter, that tree is a person. What you see is described as either usual behavior or stress behavior. So anytime that you engage or encounter someone, if that someone is a tree, you are going to engage or encounter them how they normally behave or how they are behaving under stress. Okay, so let's go to below the surface. But there are some things, motivations, if you will, that are driving whether you're seeing them in their usual behavior or whether you're seeing them in their stress behavior. And those are needs and they are interests. Okay, so here's how these play. Usual behavior is, if you go back one, Gordon, I just want to kind of take them through this a little bit. Needs, if you have a person who is getting all of their needs met or most of their needs met, and they are able to operate in their interests, their motivation, you're going to see them in their usual behavior. You're going to see them in the way that God has created them to be, whatever that may be. But if you have someone who is not getting their needs met, or is having a situation where their needs are not getting met, or they have a situation where they're operating too much out of their interest zone, you're going to experience them in their stress behavior. And that could be demoralizing to relationships, could be demoralizing to organizations, that dynamic playing out. So when we look at the Berkman, it's going to give you what you see on the surface, but it also is going to measure under the surface. And that's kind of how these things play together and interchange and engage with one another. So now we'll move on to the next slide. So there are 9 personality components, and we saw a difference in 3 with tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Those 3 are assertiveness. These are, that is number 6, insistence, and then also thought. And then if you go,
Josh,
yes.
take time to explain those terms there for the people who are listening.
Yeah, so
we'll get there, and we'll get there in a minute when we get to the actual
okay.
compound. Yeah,
we'll get there. And then in the interests, we saw one difference, and that was in persuasive. That tier 1, tier 2 church planters enjoy or are interested in persuading people more than tier 3. So let's kind of break this down a little bit more. So here's kind of some definitions, as Steve has talked about. Tier 1 church planters grow to at least 205 years. They're financially independent. Baptism rate is 5%, and average annual growth rate exceeds 5%. So these are churches that are growing. Tier 1 church planters, in all of the data that we got, we had 12 tier 1 church planters. You can see their average tenure there, 12 years. And more than half of tier 1 worked in urban communities. So communities that are 100,000 plus. Tier 2 church planters has grown to at least 150 in average attendance. They are still financially independent. Baptism rate is a key difference, as Steve touched on. It's 3%, and average annual growth rate exceeds 5%. So when you look at tier 1 and tier 2, when we got their test results, there was not much difference with them with the Berkman. But what we saw that the difference was in the baptism rate. So that idea of conversion growth versus transfer growth played a huge role in determining who was a tier 1 and who was a tier 2. So in tier 2, we had 16 planters, you see, about 10 years. So both of these tier 1 and tier 2 are at their churches for a while, worked in various community sizes, 10,000 to 100,000 people. And then tier 3 church planters, the majority of the planters that we assessed were the tier 3 church planters. They were there for 12 years, and they worked in various communities like tier 2. And then when we look at kind of their statistics of their church, again, it goes back to the definition of church planting, and that is to win lost souls. It's to bring people who were not a believer, now making them a believer. That is the purpose of planting a church. Church attendance may be low or high. Church may be financially independent. It may not be. Baptism rate is less than 3%. Annual growth is immaterial because the baptism rate is less than 3%. So as Steve said, those churches could be big. That's not what we're saying, that they're not going to be a big church. But the emphasis on sowing the gospel, reaping a harvest, seeing new believers in Christ come to faith, you do not see that as much in a tier 3 church planter. So just to clarify that. So we saw 4 differences between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So we say tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. We actually have 2 categories. So we lump tier 1 and tier 2 together, and we're going to compare and contrast it with tier 3. And then this is pretty big. 17 differences between church planters and general population. So out of 43 variables, so about 40% of these variables are different between church planters and the general population. So when you look at people who are what we believe are gifted or have the ability to plant churches or church planters, they are quite a bit different than the general population. And if you are ever around them, you will realize that they are quite a bit different than the normal population, which is okay. So let's take a look at our research results in these areas. So one of the differences that we saw was in assertiveness. So this is a usual behavior. We saw that tier 1 and tier 2 scored 62.5%, tier 3 46.8%, and the general population was at 50, just a little above 50% in assertiveness. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what you would see in their usual behavior. So if you encountered a tier 1, tier 2 church planter, when you encountered them, they would be very tell versus not suggest. Okay, they would not be suggesting. What that means is they're verbally assertive. They are completely comfortable expressing differences openly. They want to influence and they want to convince. They enjoy debate. They would walk into a room, say, hey, this is where I feel like we're going and I need help to get there. Who's with me? That's what you would experience with a very assertive person. Tier 3 is completely a different dynamic. They're different and they're agreeable. They want to avoid conflict and they strive for agreement. They hate it when there's tension, and they are pleasant. They would walk into a room with you and say, here's what I think we need to do. What does everybody else think? And so that is the difference. High caliber church planters for tier 1 and tier 2 are very much tell versus suggest. They've got a vision, they've got a mission, and they are going to elicit help in getting that accomplished. They're going to drive it. Tier 3 is not going to do that. So that's how you will experience. Next slide. Let's move on to insistence. Insistence need. Tier 1 and tier 3. So tier 1 is 21.5. Tier 3, 44.4. The general population, 47. So what does insistence mean? Well, this means flexibility versus structured. And I'm going to have Steve talk about fluidity here in just a moment, but I want to give you some examples of this here. Tier 1, tier 2 have lower insistence need, meaning they're more flexible. They have freedom from closed control. There's minimal routine. They're completely comfortable with frequent change and changing plans. Tier 3 they want defined rules, systems and procedures. It gives them comfort. This is a need. So this is below the surface. You're not going to see this. They would have to communicate this with you. They're formally defined work relationships and emotional security. So I'm going to give you an example. So I am low in insistence, and my wife would be higher because she likes more structure. When we got married, I would, on a Saturday before we had kids, we would wake up and I'd say, hey, let's just go. Let's get in the car and go. And she'd say, well, where do you want to go? I'm like, I don't know. We'll figure it out on the way. And it would drive her crazy. She's like, but we don't have a plan. I mean, we don't know where we're going to go. I'm like, we don't need a plan. We don't have kids. We can just do whatever. That's the difference. Just completely flexible, minimal routine. One more thing before I push it over to Steve. We just launched a church and we were doing these discipleship nights on for just discipleship, whatever. And she said, well, what are you going to call it? I said, I don't know. And she's like, but you got to have a name. I said, no, I don't. We just invite people, we teach them, and the name will flesh itself out later. She's like, I don't even understand. You're having a thing and you don't even have a name for it. That's how that dynamic plays out. Steve, if you'd talk a little bit more about fluidity here.
Yeah. In my 30 years of working in church planning, saw a lot of people, a lot of planters come and go, and some were successful, some were not. One of the things we recognized is that church planters tend to be able to live in fluidity, which means essentially not only flexibility, but handling themselves in times of crisis. Like, hey, we just found out that Sunday we're not going to be able to rent the space we normally have because they have to do some cleaning. And what are we going to do? And this is Friday. Or, one of them, something I'm doing here isn't working and I got to, put it to rest, make changes right now because it's just not working for us. We need to make a decision today. That's what we call fluidity, the ability to flex with the emerging situation. And we also recognize that some pastors or some planters who are trying to be planters really couldn't live with that. They needed structure in order to be at their best. And in fact, we came to the point of advising these kinds of people going through assessment that they needed to go and be in an established church because the structures were already there to support their abilities, to bring out the best in them. However, we didn't really have a clear way of measuring fluidity. And Berkman has actually, this particular section gives that kind of information by being able to identify the load, insistent need. It's not that church planners don't like structure. Usual behavior can be, very adherent to structure. Like, we're not just starting this church. We need to have structure. How are we going to do discipleship effectively, evangelism effectively, so on and so forth? We create structure. But in terms of my personal need, I don't need structure, as Josh was just talking about, in order to be at my best. And therefore, I don't get frustrated. I don't get stressed out when things aren't going well. Actually, I feel the challenge. I step up to that challenge. That's what fluidity needs to, this is why fluidity needs to be measured. Because church planners who don't have a low need for insistence tend to freeze up at critical moments or put their efforts in the wrong things and can't stop themselves. And then they find that those things that they've invested in, or that moment when they needed to make a decision, was a critical one in the success of their church plan.
Yeah, and I will say one more thing when we talk about need. This is a great part of the dynamic of needs to be able to be measured, because this is one of those things I think it's key that church planners don't need the structure, but they can be coached to appreciate structure and to put a little bit of structure even in their daily routine. I've met a lot of church planners that have said, I'm working on my sermon on Saturday night because I just haven't had the time during the week to do it. And I'm thinking, yep, that would have been me, 7 years ago, 6 years ago. But it's been coached. Here's how you handle the preaching schedule. Here's why you put it forward first. Here's, and so those are things that when we talk about coaching materials and we talk about being able to raise someone from a tier 3 to a tier 2 or tier 2 to a tier 1 or whatnot, those are things that can be coached. And it's great that we now can actually quantify this and have a name for it, so that we can see it and coach church planters. So just last thing on sentence, this was a huge piece of the research that we felt like was extremely important. So thank you, Steve, for sharing that. Next is a thought need. So this is, again, below the surface. This is not something that you're going to perceive usually. Meaning, thought need. Tier 1, tier 2 church planters have a very high need for thought. 85.5, you see it. General population, tier 3, they do not have as high of a need for thought. Let's look at how this plays out as we kind of describe this. So what this means, and this is going to seem very strange, because I think a lot of times, because of the high assertiveness, people do not perceive that church planters have this need. But I will speak from experience. We do a lot of times have this need. We need ample time to think, to get counsel and suggestions, and to discuss some concerns. ample time to pray, ample time to read, ample time to do all of that. So this is kind of like ready, aim, and shoot. Okay. Tier 3 is lower. They want immediate action, minimize ambiguity, limit discussion. So it's aim and shoot. But the tier 1 church planter and the tier 2 church planter knows, especially early on, that a misstep could be really a big speed bump in establishing a church. And so they're going to step back and they're going to say, hold on a second, before we move forward with that idea, or before we allow so-and-so to run with that idea, it might be a good idea, but does it really fit into our culture and our core values? What is this? I need to extrapolate out 2-3 months, a year. If we run with this, what does that look like? How does that impact the church? And so this is a need. They want to step back and be thoughtful about the decisions that they make. Now, here's the key. From experience and what I've understood from other church planners, once they've taken the time to do that and they come to a decision, they're ready to roll. Like there's no, oh, well, I don't know anymore. No, this is what we're doing. So the challenge here for church planners that have this high thought need is to bring the other decision makers along in the process with them while they're gathering the information, while they're beginning to think about, all right, here's the next step 8 months from now. Now these decision makers, hey, here's what I'm thinking. Just want to keep you in the loop. Here's what I'm reading. Want to keep you. Here's what a mentor said. Here's what I'm feeling in prayer. So that by the time you get to 8 months, everybody's on the same page and you say, hey, now we're rolling. We've been talking about this the whole time, or for the last month or 2, whatever that looks like. So really important need here too, the ability to think, pray, get counsel, and discuss concerns. It's huge. And then interest is persuasive. Tier 1 and tier 2, when we talk about interest, what do they want to do? They want to persuade people. They want to persuade people to action. Most of the general population does not want to do that. That's why they don't like going to car dealerships, right? Because you go to a car dealership, they're persuading you to buy a car. Nobody wants that. Can I just go and browse and look? No, you can't go browse and look. They got to make their money. They got to get you to buy a car, right? Tier 3, 63.4%. So what we see in tier 1 and tier 2 church planners, their interest is in persuading people. So next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about that kind of breakdown. So they're persuading, they're influencing, they're motivating, they're convincing, they're selling. I mean, think about that movie that you love so much, right? And everybody's backs against the wall, like, right, Independence Day, and here's the president and he's about to speak and he's going to get everybody riled up and they're like, yeah, or any kind of war movie or anything like that. There comes that moment where there's that speech. Well, that's what a tier 1, tier 2 person loves. They love to persuade and influence and motivate, sell and convince. The tier 3, they're going to avoid that. They feel very uncomfortable with that. They avoid verbal influence. They want to use facts more so than drive emotion. We know that both of those are needed. And so they resent strong sales tactics, right? And so, again, this is a great opportunity for coaching, even in using people on your team. If you've got someone who loves to motivate, let them start the discussion and get everybody's emotions rolling and be like, yes, let's buy into this. And then bring somebody else on the team that's going to now say, all right, now let me tell you the facts that's going to back up all that emotion, and you capture both. So again, this interest of persuasion, that's what tier 1, tier 2 church planters love to do, that's opposed to tier 3. So just a kind of a summary. Assertive is high. That usual score, how you normally see them. Insistence is low. Thought is high. These are needs. These are underneath the surface. So if you have a church planner who doesn't have time to think, a tier 1, tier 2 doesn't have, is forced into structure or whatnot, that usual behavior is going to now turn into stress behavior, and you're going to see them in a different light. Or if they're having to not use their interest of persuading, if they're having to dig too deep in numbers and all that kind of stuff, you're going to see that stress behavior increase. And so that's just a summary, and now I'm going to kick it over to Gordon to kind of analyze our research and give you some real life examples of this.
Well, thank you, Joshua and Steve. I appreciate you guys so much. By the way, Joshua is doing his DMin dissertation on this subject, so he's going to be our subject matter expert, already is. And Steve has just always been an expert. So, we went through and did a comparison of a tier 1 and a tier 3 church planter. And this is interesting. The tier 3 planter is a church planter whose church plant failed. Steve knows this individual.
Yes.
And I know the tier 1, tier 2 guy personally. The tier 1, tier 2 assertiveness usual 62. Well, this actual T1 planter, tier 1 planter, scored 81. He was more assertive than usual. He has to be careful that he doesn't overwhelm people with his tell versus suggest kind of a mentality. He's a real tell guy. But the tier 3 planter, interestingly enough, his assertiveness is 98. And it's possible, and I've worked with lots of pastors and so on, when people get a really high assertiveness score, they have to be careful because they can just bowl people over. And I don't know if that's the case here. Steve knows the planter, and that may have been the case, that he was just too verbally assertive.
He was hard to coach because he asserted that his way was the right way. He wanted to do it his way. There's nothing necessarily wrong with having strong-minded planters, but there is something that assertive people need to be careful of, and that is to throw out really good advice or good coaching. And this is what he was doing.
Okay. Now we'll move on to their insistence need. Now remember, needs are not visible. They're below the surface. And so we saw the tier 1 and tier 2s were at 23, score of 23. And this actual planter's insistence need, his fluidity, his flexibility was 7. This guy is really comfortable with changing on the fly. But notice the tier 3 planter. This is the church planter that failed. His insistence need is in the mid-50s, which means he needs a lot of structure. And he moved from being a church planter to being on staff in a church, and it was a good move for him. That fit him better. He needs structure. He needs structure. So then thought need. The tier 1, tier 2 thought need was about 86. And this actual planter, his thought need was 98, which means he takes a lot of time before he pulls the trigger. He's not a ready, fire, aim kind of a person. He's ready, aim, let's check, make sure we're ready, let's aim again. Okay, now we can fire. And as Josh said, when they do make up their mind, then it's time to act. But and the tier 3 planter was at 84. He was about the same as a typical tier 1, tier 2. So this was not a discerning or a factor that really impacted them. But notice his persuasive score. Actual planner was at 97. This guy loves to persuade people. Whenever I talk to him, I mean, he's a persuader. He's a great guy. And tier 3 is not a great persuader. And if you're going to be a church planter, we found that persuasion is absolutely essential. And this probably played into this fellow's failure as a church planter. He couldn't persuade people to join him to move the ball down the field. So that's just a comparison of 2 planters, one that has done really well and one that didn't do so well. Just a way of showing you how well this Berkman profile can help in church planting. Now we're going to apply the research to a case study. This is an individual who wants to become a church planter, and we're been working with them. And here is the overall Berkman profile. Usual behavior. Usual behavior means it's how we show up, how people see us. And notice this particular fellow, this individual, this church planter, has an assertiveness usual of 72. He's in the ballpark. He's in the ballpark. He has started his own business and so forth, but he's in the ballpark. But notice his restlessness. Now, restlessness was not one of the things that showed up here, but I wanted to show the overall profile of this individual versus a tier 1, tier 2. And his restlessness is quite low, which means he likes sameness. He likes things to happen. And so the Berkman would say at this point, Pastor, we need to talk a little bit about your restlessness. You can't get stuck in a rut. You can't just do the same things over and over again. And if you just in listening to Josh, you can see that Josh is all over the place. He's a really restless guy. He likes to see lots of things happening and lots of changes happening. Not so much so with this guy. But now let's look at his interests, or his interests. His needs. Another word for need is expectations. What do we expect from life? And notice this planter has a really high physical energy need. And what that means is he needs outlet for physical energy, a busy schedule, and opportunity for physical activities. This individual score is 93. He has to be busy with something all the time, which may work against being an effective church planter because there's times you have to just stop and pull back and survey the situation before you move ahead. Then his self-consciousness need is 99. And self-consciousness need, that means that he needs personalized approval, individual interaction, and a tactful approach. So this guy needs to be liked by everybody. And as a pastor or as a church planter, there's times people may not like what we're doing, but we have to do what needs to be done. And so for this particular planter, I would want to talk to him and say, you need to realize that you're going to have to make some hard decisions and not everybody's going to agree with you. And you have to be able to live with that, but you have to be aware. Self-awareness is a big part of the Berkman. And then notice his insistence need. His insistence need is really high, much higher even than the planter that we looked at before. This individual needs structure, a lot of structure. So he may work better as in an established church. He may work well as an executive pastor, for example, because executive pastors give structure. So that's a possibility. Steve, would you like to say anything to that?
Yeah, I teach systems and coach people on how to build effective church systems, and that's about structure. And so when you look at somebody like this potential planter, you immediately recognize that he is not going to have the fluidity, or he's not going to be able to live with fluidity. He's going to establish a structure because he needs it. Otherwise, he'd be stressed. And that structure that he creates will probably keep him from being able to handle the constant flow of things in church planting. And I would say to this person, you make a great system builder
Yes.
because you have the tendencies towards that.
Yes. So as you look at his needs, he needs a definite plan in place, detailed instructions, defined rules, systems, and procedures. So not exactly what we've discovered with church planners. And then his thought need is considerably lower than what we would see with a church, our typical church planner. So he needs people around him who will say, wait a minute, Pastor, let's just back off a little bit. And let's pray about this before we make the decision. And Howard Hendricks at Dallas Seminary used to say, you better get it right the first time because you realize how hard it is to change. So that's a reflection of this thought need. And then his interest. Notice his persuasiveness. This guy's persuasiveness is 99, which is as high as it gets. That's a real plus for a church planter.
Yeah.
But his social service score is 99. And we've seen this with pastors and planters, that social service, when you have a real high social service score, we had one planter whose social service is 99, and he's planted a church that grew to 750 pre-COVID, and it's now at 600. But he has learned how to delegate. But as Steve would say, well, what's the term that you use for somebody with high social service?
Yeah, I call them high-touch shepherds. They have to constantly touch the sheep, and in order to feel good about themselves, instead of leading the sheep.
Yes, there's a difference between leading the sheep and caring for the individual sheep, leading the flock versus tending the sheep. So, and Gary Westra, one of the original founders of Turnaround Pastors, said, "Yeah, petting the sheep. That's really bad, really bad." Okay, so
Okay.
now some questions. We did have some questions here, and the first question is: established pastors usually can't afford to be a tell kind of leader. How is that different or preferred among church plants? In other words, are people who attend a church plant more willing to be told than suggested? And I will address this question. One of the things we discovered with all of our research is that the most effective revitalization pastors are more tell than suggest. As a matter of fact, church planters, effective church planters and effective turnaround pastors scores are almost identical in that. Church planters are a little higher. But we discovered that churches want to be led, they don't want to be driven. And the same, I think, with church planters. They want to be led, not driven. And I've worked with a number of pastors whose assertiveness is 99, and we have to help them learn how to back down on their assertiveness so they don't just bowl people over with their assertiveness. So, Rob, your question was a good one. And Rob had another question. Also, over time, would you surmise that those who attend a church plant eventually desire the tier 3 kind of pastor? Steve or Josh, you jump at that.
Well, would they prefer? Yes, they would prefer. And I think Gordon, you and I have talked about this. You know, whether you're a turnaround pastor or whatnot, you kind of have a life expectancy maybe at a church, because people just get tired of, you know, like you talked about, the decisions and the, I don't know, atmosphere that's needed to turn around a church. It takes an inordinate amount of drive, determination, all of that. You have to disappoint people constantly, you know. So yeah, I think that maybe over time they would prefer it, but then we have to ask the question, is that actually what's best for the church? Because when you get a tier 3 person with a group that wants a tier 3, then are they really then reaching people with the gospel? Or can you basically just predict that this is going to plateau and this is going to decline over time?
Yes.
And so I think that's it. Yes. Would they prefer it? But is that needed? I would say probably not.
Yes.
We're seeing a lot more. We're seeing a lot more what we call founding pastors in the church planting over the last 20, 30 years, where before people would start a church and 2 or 3 years later leave it, and another pastor would come. And the very kind of conditions you were just talking about happens, where they say, "Oh man, you know, we need somebody who's more stable, more kind, more, you know, more like us," whatever it is, and they call the opposite in, and that creates problems. So many of the planters I've been able to work with have said, "I'm not just going to plant this church. I'm going to stay there and take it through the phases of growth. 20, 30 years down the road, they're still there." And normally when these founding pastors leave, they have worked on a succession plan, maybe somebody on staff that they have groomed for the position, maybe somebody that they know that's going to be able to help the church get to the next phase. And they have set up a leadership team that's protecting the flock from, a decision that might flow from, a moment of, we want somebody different. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think that it's perverse nature of people to always want what they didn't have and not think about the value of the person that has led them, other than say, well, we really appreciate all he did. But the fact of the matter is that this church was established and is doing well in sowing the gospel to the community because it was led to do that. And the skill sets of this planter are still needed. Maybe there will always be differences. There's no two pastors exactly alike, but definitely you don't want the opposite of this pastor.
Yes.
Because and yet, like I say, churches do that. That's why you we're seeing a different kind of approach to placing pastors in church plants versus established churches. Because the longer a church is established, the more they're open to variety. But in a church plant, you don't want to lose the momentum that was being built up over the years by bringing in somebody who has a totally different view of ministry from the pastor who
Yes,
planted the
great.
church.
Great response. As a matter of fact, we have some of our church planters should be serial church planters. They need to come in, establish a church, then move on and do it again, because they can't make the transition from loosey-goosey fluidity to structure. And then there were a few of those. And when they stayed long, the churches went downhill, and most of them closed eventually because they didn't have the right skill sets to take the church to the next level.
Yeah.
So
that's a very good point.
So there was another question from Pastor Henderson. Was there a difference in score based on ethnicity? And Josh, you want to address that?
I think we measured all types of different ethnicities, and we didn't see any statistical differences in the ethnicity. So
yeah. And then Pastor Henderson also, does the context make a difference? Does the context make it different? Suburban, urban? Are there differences in planners between suburban and urban? Steve, you've had probably the most experience in this area. Could you address that?
Yeah, sometimes we see guys go to rural areas that have extraordinary skills. And being in the country, you would think, well, there's fewer people there, fewer opportunities, but we've actually seen those planters flourish just as well in rural areas as if they went to a suburban or urban area. They may not have necessarily the biggest church, but they have a larger church because they're sowing the gospel. And one of the realities of America is that there are more lost people in any given county in America than there are Christians. And even if the churches in every county had their sanctuary filled twice on any given Sunday, there would still be more people to reach with the gospel. And this is one of the realities for these guys that go to the country or outside the cities, I should say, city areas, is that they recognize there's a harvest field here.
Yes.
And I care about these people, and they need, not the the leftover church planter who can't find a organization to send them to the city, so they go to the country because there's nothing left for them. They need the best kind of evangelists and planters to go to the country too. So we've seen that. We've seen people who have. I'm thinking specifically about a church up in northern Minnesota that not only planted a significant sized church, I think it grew to 600, but it also planted daughter churches throughout the region because the vision of the pastor was beyond just, hey, let's just reach this small town. And so therefore, this is the kind of mentality we need in the planters, and these are tier 1 kinds of planters. Yeah.
Sure. And we had a couple of guys, the tier 3 planters, who went to ministry areas that had not even 600 people total, and they've planted significant churches in those areas. But again, are they reaching people for Christ? That's the key thing. And we're establishing a long-term church, not just going out and plant a church and say we planted a church, but going out and planted a sustaining church that's going to make an impact for years to come. Here's another question.
Gordon, I live in Florida, and that last statement you make is really significant because, of course, a lot of denominations have planted churches in Florida, and people who move from the north, say Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, New York, are coming down looking for a church similar to what they grew up with. And so these are really transfer growth churches, and they can look really significant. I think of one specific one, I won't mention the town, but it during the snowbird season was running over 900 people. And it did this for years And I warned the pastor that unless they became evangelistic and began to be concerned about the community around them, that they would hit a downward trend and then suddenly plunge. And that's exactly what happened.
Mm.
So, you know, if you do this in Florida, plant a church just for the immigrants that are already Christians, eventually it's going to be telling because it's just a transfer growth church.
Yes. Hmm. So let me bring up one more slide, and because people wanted some contact information, so I will share the slide. So if you want to take the Berkman, you're interested in it, you can contact me. There's my email address, Gordon@turnaroundpastor.com. If you have questions, you can contact Steve at churchequippers.com or Joshua at harvest247.org. And you can sign up for our newsletter at turnaroundpastor.com. So I'm going to leave these up here for just a moment. I just want you to know, and I think it probably shows, but Steve and Josh and I have had such a good working relationship. And I am not a church planter. As a matter of fact, if you look at my persuasiveness, it's really quite low. It's the rest of them are good, but I'm not a car salesman. And but we've had just such a great time working together, and it's been a long, arduous process. But if you have questions or you have needs, don't be afraid to contact us. And if you want to involve yourself in the Berkman, don't look at it as an investment. How can I invest in such a way that I will be more effective as a pastor or as a planter? And so look at that as an investment. And even churches often want to, they're saying, oh, we can't do this, we can't invest. One of the churches I pastored should have done a much better job in selecting their next pastoral candidate. And we were working with Paul Borden at the time, and Paul said, if you get the wrong pastor, it's going to set you back 5 years. And then if you you move back 5 years, and you have to move forward again another 5 years. So it's going to cost you 10 years. Actually, it costs more than that.
Yeah.
And it set them back 10 years. And so don't be afraid to invest. You guys have any parting words of wisdom?
I will say that we said at the beginning that this is not only an assessment tool to help you to choose the right planners, but also a coaching guide. And one valuable tool that Berkman itself supplies is a coaching sheet or a readout that tells you how specifically to coach this particular person to effectiveness. And they'll tell you a lot more about the planter than any assessment center could possibly tell you. And so it makes the coaching job easier, and it assures you that as you're working with this planter, that planter is probably going to get better because you're dealing with the issues that really need to be dealt with.
Good.
That's a great value.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Joshua.
Yeah, I would say that at least to me, one of the biggest keys of being effective in any type of ministry or any type of leadership is knowing yourself, and then having the discipline to grow, and even in those hard places. So look, it's an investment, but so are buying books or going to conferences, all of those things, different type of investment. But it will really help you, and it'll help you know how you need to structure not only yourself, but your team. It'll help you know when and understand and evaluate, all right, why am I operating in a lot of stress and whatnot? And so I think it's very, very valuable. So I would just encourage you to do it, and go Dogs.
Okay, let's pray. Thanks, Father, for this time. Thank you for these men. Thank you for those who have joined us, and for those who will join us as they view this in the future. Lord, we want to be good stewards of our time and our resources, and we want to be the most effective we can be in serving the Savior. So help us to that end, we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
And
Okay,